I never thought a text message could smell like death, but the one I received on December 22nd reeked of it. My name is Frank. I'm 67 years old, and I've spent the last 4 decades raising cattle in the cold mountains of Montana. My hands are calloused, my back aches every morning, and my knees crack when I climb out of bed. But my instincts, the ones that kept me alive through blizzards, wolf attacks, and financial disasters, those are still sharp as the hunting knife I carry in my pocket. I was wrapping Christmas presents that night, a bottle of aged whiskey and a hand-knitted scarf for my son Ethan. He'd promised this would be the best Christmas ever. The kid had built himself a successful logistics company in Denver, married a beautiful woman, bought a Victorian house in the suburbs. Everything I'd worked for, sacrificed for, it had paid off in him. Then my phone buzzed. The message was short, brutal. "Old man, don't come, don't need you. Stay at your ranch and die alone." I read it 10 times. The wind outside howled against my cabin walls, but the cold I felt came from inside my chest. Ethan never called me old man with contempt. To him I was Dad or Chief. And the kid was a perfectionist about grammar. This message was full of errors. Someone else had his phone. Someone who wanted me to stay away. That's when I knew my son was in trouble. I grabbed my truck keys, loaded my Fort 5 into the glove compartment, and drove through the night toward Denver. 7 hours through a snowstorm, fueled by coffee and a father's instinct that something was terribly, horribly wrong. If you want to know what I found when I got there, stay with me, because what happened next would test everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and how far a father will go to save his son. I pulled up to Ethan's house just after midnight on December 23rd. The Victorian beauty he'd bought 3 years ago, the one he'd sent me pictures of every step of the renovation, looked wrong in the darkness. The Christmas lights he'd always loved were off. Not broken, not burned out, just off. But music pounded from inside, some kind of heavy electronic bass that made the windows vibrate. That wasn't Ethan's style. My son listened to classic rock and old country, the stuff I'd raised him on. 3 black pickup trucks were parked on his pristine lawn, their tires digging deep ruts into the grass he'd spent weekends perfecting. Montana plates, Wyoming plates, Nevada plates, not Colorado, not local. I'd been a rancher long enough to know when predators had moved into someone's territory. I rang the doorbell. After a long pause, Jessica answered. My daughter-in-law looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her expensive silk robe hung wrong on her thin frame, and her eyes, those were the eyes of a cornered animal. She tried to block the doorway with her body, but I could see past her into the living room. Her family had taken over. Her father, Victor, was sprawled on Ethan's leather couch, drinking wine straight from a bottle, the expensive kind Ethan collected. The man looked like a bulldog wearing a cheap suit, all jowls and mean little eyes. Jessica's brother, Tyler, sat in Ethan's favorite chair, cleaning his fingernails with a hunting knife. Prison tattoos crawled up his neck like angry serpents. These weren't the successful business family Jessica had told us about. These were something else entirely. Jessica stammered something about Ethan having the flu, sleeping upstairs, didn't want to be disturbed. Her voice shook with every word. The story fell apart even as she told it. I asked to see my son. Said I'd driven 7 hours through a blizzard and wasn't leaving without seeing him with my own eyes. Tyler appeared behind his sister, shoving her aside. He informed me in crude terms that I wasn't welcome, that I should go back to my hick ranch before he called the cops on me for trespassing. The way he said it, the threat in his eyes, this was a man used to intimidating people, a man who enjoyed it. Victor laughed from the couch, suggesting I was too old to understand that young people needed space. He made a joke about senile old ranchers who couldn't take a hint. They were trying to humiliate me, make me doubt myself. I'd seen this before with wolves, predators testing if their prey would run. The door slammed in my face. The deadbolt clicked. I stood on that porch in the freezing December air, my breath coming out in clouds, and made a decision. I wasn't some confused old man who'd driven down here by mistake. I was a father who knew his son, who'd raised that boy from diapers to diploma, who'd taught him to tie his shoes and balance a checkbook and treat people with respect. And Ethan would never send that text message, never tell me to die alone, never allow his house to be invaded by people who drank his wine and mocked his father. Something was very, very wrong. I walked back to my truck, but I didn't get in. Instead, I circled around to the back of the house, using the oak trees for cover. My knees protested, but I ignored them. I'd tracked wounded cattle through snow for miles. I could handle one suburban backyard. The garden that Ethan had shown me in photos last spring was destroyed. Tire tracks tore through what had been flower beds. The old tool shed at the back of the property, barely standing, scheduled for demolition, now had a brand-new industrial-strength padlock on its door. That's when I heard it, the faint metallic sound, the sound of chains moving against wood, and I knew where my son was. I've gutted dying cattle, pulled stillborn calves from their mothers, and put down horses with broken legs. I thought I'd seen the worst that life could show a man. I was wrong. The old shed stood crooked against the fence line, wood rotting, roof sagging. Ethan had planned to tear it down in the spring, but someone had reinforced the door with new hinges and that heavy padlock. Fresh screws gleamed in the moonlight. I pressed my ear against the weathered boards. Inside, I heard breathing, labored, painful breathing, and that metallic clink of chains. My hand shook as I found an old crowbar in the snow, not from cold, from rage older and deeper than any I'd known. The kind of rage that makes a 67-year-old rancher strong enough to tear through a locked door like it was paper. The padlock held, but the old wood around the hinges didn't. 2 hard pulls, and the door frame splintered. What I saw inside will haunt me until I die. Ethan was chained to a support beam like an animal. My son, my strong, successful, always put-together son, was barely recognizable. His face was a mass of purple and yellow bruises. His left eye was swollen shut. Blood had dried in his hair, on his shirt, on the concrete floor beneath him. His right leg bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. Broken. Days ago, by the look of it. No medical attention, just left to suffer. But what made me see red, what made my vision narrow to a pinpoint of fury, were the tables set up along the far wall, industrial scales, packages wrapped in plastic, burner phones, ledgers with numbers and routes written in neat columns. I'd lived through the 70s and 80s. I knew what a drug operation looked like. They were using my son's trucking company to move product across state lines, using his trucks, his routes, his reputation. And when he'd refused or threatened to go to the police, they'd done this. Ethan's eyes flickered open, one eye, the only one that could still open. He recognized me, tried to speak, could barely whisper. He told me to run, said they'd kill me, said it was too late for him anyway. I told him I hadn't driven through a blizzard just to run away. Told him we were both getting out of this alive or neither of us was. I started working on the chains, looking for the lock, when I heard the shed door creak wider behind me. Tyler stood in the doorway backlit by the house lights, a baseball bat in his hands. The smile on his face was the smile of a man who enjoyed hurting people. He said something about old men who didn't know when to mind their own business. Said he'd been hoping I'd show up so he could teach me some manners. The bat tapped against his palm with each word, a steady rhythm of threat. He didn't know who he was dealing with. I'm not some suburban dad who's never been in a fight. I'm a Montana rancher who's fought off wolves with my bare hands, who's broken up bar fights, who's had to put down men who tried to rustle my cattle. I've lived rough, fought hard, and survived things that would have killed softer men. Tyler stepped into the shed, confident, sure of himself, young and strong, used to intimidating people with his size and his prison tattoos. But young and strong isn't the same as experienced and desperate. I grabbed the crowbar I'd used on the door. The shed was small, the ceiling low. His bat needed room to swing. My crowbar didn't. What happened next happened fast. He swung high. I ducked low, felt the bat whistle over my head, and drove the crowbar into his knee. The sound of the impact, the way his leg buckled, that was the sound of a tide turning. He went down screaming. I didn't give him time to recover. Took the bat from his hands, cable-tied his wrists with zip ties I pulled from my jacket pocket, the same ones I use for cattle tagging, and dragged him to the same beam where my son was chained. One of Tyler's own chains went around his wrists. Poetic justice, my father would have called it. Ethan stared at me with his one working eye, something like hope flickering there for the first time. He wanted to know how we'd get out, how we'd get past Victor and the others in the house. I told him I'd figure it out. But first, we needed evidence. Because if we ran now, they'd just come after us. We needed to end this permanently. I started photographing everything with my phone, the drugs, the ledgers, the chains, Ethan's injuries, Tyler's face, every detail that would make a prosecutor salivate. That's when the shed door opened again and Victor walked in with a gun. Victor looked at the scene, his son chained up, me with a phone full of evidence, and smiled. Not a friendly smile, a smile that said he'd killed before and wouldn't lose sleep over doing it again. He informed me that I'd made a very serious mistake by not minding my own business. Said that Jessica had told him I was a simple rancher, too old and too stupid to be a real threat. He'd let his guard down, let Tyler handle me alone. That was his error. He wouldn't make it again. The gun in his hand was a 9mm, held like someone who knew how to use it. He kept his distance, smart enough not to get close. Told me to put the phone down slowly, said he'd decide whether I died quick or slow, depending on how cooperative I was. Behind me, Ethan made a sound, half sob, half warning. He was apologizing, saying he'd tried to protect me by sending that text, tried to keep me away from this. That's when I understood. They'd forced him to send it, hoping I'd stay in Montana. When I came anyway, it complicated their operation. Now they had to deal with me. Victor explained it all with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. How Jessica had seemed like such a good investment when Ethan married her. Educated, sophisticated, from a wealthy family. How she'd never mentioned that her wealth came from drug money, that her father ran operations across 5 states, that her brother had connections in 3 prisons. They'd slowly infiltrated Ethan's business. Started with small shipments in his trucks, hidden among legitimate cargo. When Ethan discovered it 3 weeks ago and threatened to go to the police, they'd shown him what happened to people who threatened the family business. The beating, the broken leg, the chains, and the ultimatum: sign over power of attorney to Jessica, or they'd make him disappear and claim he'd abandoned his business and run off with a mistress. They had fake emails ready, fake phone records. They'd done this before. Ethan had been holding out, refusing to sign. That's why they were still keeping him alive. But their patience was wearing thin. Christmas morning, Victor said Ethan would sign or Ethan would die. Simple as that. And now I was a complication they didn't need. Victor raised the gun, aiming at my chest. He suggested I make peace with my maker, old man. Told me my cattle would probably starve without me. Seemed to find that funny. I didn't move, didn't flinch, because while he'd been monologuing like a bad movie villain, my hand had slowly moved to my jacket pocket, to the .45 I'd carried for 40 years, the one that had killed 3 wolves, 2 rabid dogs, and 1 man who'd tried to steal my truck at a rest stop in 1988. Montana ranchers don't carry guns for show. We carry them because when something needs killing, we can't wait for the police to drive 2 hours to help us. I told Victor he'd made 2 mistakes. First, he'd assumed I was just some old man. Second, he'd gotten too close while running his mouth. The .45 cleared my pocket and fired before he could process what was happening. I didn't aim for center mass. Too many bones, too much risk of overpenetration. I aimed for his gun hand. The shot echoed like thunder in the small shed. Victor's 9mm flew from his shattered hand, skittering across the concrete floor. He stumbled backward, shock and pain wiping the smile off his face. He screamed about his hand, called me insane, said I'd just signed my own death warrant. I picked up his weapon, emptied the magazine into my pocket, and pointed my .45 at his face. Told him to sit down and shut up before I decided that Montana didn't have extradition for shooting drug dealers. My heart was hammering. My hands were steadier than they had any right to be. Adrenaline makes old men young again, at least for a little while. I zip-tied Victor next to his son, both of them secured to the beam. Used his own expensive silk tie to bandage his hand, wasn't going to let him bleed out. I needed him alive for what came next. Ethan asked what I was doing, voice barely above a whisper. He wanted to know why I wasn't calling the police right now, why I was waiting. I told him we needed Jessica on record, needed her complicit, because if we called the cops now, she'd play the innocent wife, claim she had no idea what her family was doing. With her clean record and good lawyers, she'd walk. Then she'd come after us later, finish what her family started. No, we needed her to condemn herself, needed her to show her true face. I checked Ethan's chains, made sure they were secure enough to look real but loose enough that he could slip them if needed. Told him to play unconscious when Jessica came to check, told him to trust me. Then I left the shed, pulled the broken door mostly closed, and walked to the back of the house. The kitchen window was unlocked, suburban negligence. I climbed inside, my knees screaming protest, and made my way toward the living room where I'd seen lights. The house was quiet now. The music had stopped. I could hear movement upstairs, footsteps in what must be the master bedroom. I had maybe 10 minutes before someone came looking for Victor and Tyler. 10 minutes to turn this from a rescue into justice. Because I wasn't just saving my son, I was going to make sure these people never hurt anyone again. I stood in my son's kitchen, my .45 heavy in my hand, and listened to the house breathe. Upstairs, Jessica moved around the bedroom. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows. In the shed, 2 men sat chained and bleeding. 67 years of life had taught me one critical truth. Violence solves immediate problems, but justice solves permanent ones. I could have called 911 right then, could have had police swarming the place in minutes, but I'd spent enough time around law enforcement to know how these things played out. Rich white girl married to a successful businessman claims she knew nothing about her family's criminal activities. Her lawyers, and she'd have the best, would paint her as another victim, manipulated by her father, threatened into silence. She'd walk, and walking people have a way of coming back. No, I needed more than evidence of drug trafficking. I needed evidence of conspiracy. Evidence that Jessica wasn't a victim, but an active participant. Evidence that would hold up against the expensive legal team that drug money could buy. I photographed the living room with my phone, the wine bottles, the drugs casually left on the coffee table, the paperwork spread across Ethan's desk that showed Jessica's signature on company documents dated after Ethan's disappearance. Smart girl, establishing her authority in writing. Then I found her laptop on the kitchen counter. Still open, still logged in. Careless. Or maybe arrogant. When you've gotten away with something for 3 weeks, you stop being careful. I'm not a computer expert. I'm a rancher who learned to use email because my grandson taught me. But I know how to look through documents, and I know what constitutes evidence. Her email was a gold mine. Messages to her father about shipments, routes, timing. Messages about Ethan becoming a problem that needed permanent handling. Messages about power of attorney and accessing his business accounts, all sent from her personal email, all with her name attached. I photographed everyone, sent copies to my own email just in case. But the real prize was in her text messages, conversations with someone named Marcus, apparently their buyer in Las Vegas. She told him that Ethan would be gone by Christmas, that she'd have full control of the company by New Year, that they'd be able to triple their shipping capacity once the husband problem was resolved. The husband problem. That's what she called my son. The man she'd married, promised to love and cherish. A problem to be eliminated. I thought about all the Sunday dinners we'd had, Jessica sitting at my table, smiling, asking about the ranch, playing the perfect daughter-in-law. I'd liked her, trusted her. Thought Ethan had finally found someone who'd take care of him the way his mother would have wanted. Shows how much I knew. Upstairs, a door opened. Footsteps on the stairs. Jessica's voice called out for her father, asking if everything was settled, if the old man had left. I moved quickly back to the kitchen window, slipped outside, and positioned myself where I could see the back door. She'd check on Ethan soon. They were torturing him for signatures, after all. Had to make sure he hadn't died of infection or shock. When she made her nightly visit to the shed, I'd be waiting. Through the window, I watched her move through the kitchen, pour herself a glass of wine, check her phone. She looked tired, but satisfied. A woman confident in her control of the situation. She finished her wine, grabbed a bottle of water and what looked like pain medication, and headed for the back door. Her nightly routine, I guessed. Keep Ethan alive enough to sign, dead enough not to fight. She opened the door to the shed without hesitation. No fear, no caution. She'd done this dozens of times. I followed her in. 45. Pointed at her back. Told her to set down the water and medication slowly. Told her to turn around with her hands visible. The look on her face when she saw me, that was worth the 7-hour drive and the aching knees and the fear that I'd been too late. That was the look of someone realizing their perfect plan had just collapsed. She tried the innocent routine immediately, started crying, saying her family had forced her, that she'd been threatened, that she was scared for her life. The tears looked real enough. She probably practiced in the mirror. I let her talk, let her build her defense, her story, her plea for sympathy. Then I held up my phone and showed her the photographs of her emails, the text messages, the signatures, the timeline showing she'd been planning this for months before Ethan discovered anything. Her tears stopped like someone had flipped a switch. The mask came off. She called me a meddling old fool, said I should have stayed on my ranch like she'd told Ethan to write, said I'd just signed my own death warrant because her family had connections that went beyond what I could imagine. They'd kill me, kill Ethan, make it look like a murder-suicide. Crazy old dad couldn't handle his son's success, snapped, killed them both. They'd done it before, she said. They'd do it again. But her voice had an edge of panic now. She'd noticed that her father and brother weren't in the shed. She was asking where they were, what I'd done with them. I told her they were taking a nap. Told her she'd be joining them soon. Told her that the difference between me and her was simple. I'd spent 40 years protecting things I loved from predators, and she'd spent 30 years being one. Then I zip-tied her hands, sat her down next to the beam with the others, and made my first call. Not to 911. To my lawyer, the one who'd handled my will, my property disputes, my business dealings for 20 years. I told him everything, every detail. Made sure it was on record, attorney-client privilege, documented and witnessed, insurance, in case things went wrong. Then I called my second number. Sheriff Tom Ramirez, an old friend from my rodeo days who'd retired to Denver PD, he owed me a favor from 1985. Big favor, life-saving favor. I told him I needed that favor called in tonight. Told him what I had. Told him to bring the DEA if he wanted the bust of his career. While I waited, I finally cut Ethan's chains off. Really cut them. He collapsed into my arms, my strong son reduced to a broken shadow. I held him while he cried, from pain, from relief, from humiliation at what he'd endured. I told him what his mother used to tell him when he was scared. Lightning storms don't last forever, but oak trees do. We were oak trees, and this storm was about to break. The police arrived 22 minutes after my call. Sheriff Tom Ramirez came in first, 3 DEA agents behind him, all armed like they were raiding a cartel compound, which I suppose they were. Tom took one look at me, old rancher covered in blood that wasn't mine, sitting next to 3 zip-tied suspects and 1 tortured victim, and shook his head. He muttered something about how I always did have a talent for finding trouble. I handed him my phone with all the evidence. Told him to look at the emails first, then the photos, Then the financial documents I'd found in the house. Told him about the drugs in the shed, the shipping routes and the ledgers, the whole operation laid out like a gift-wrapped present. The DEA agents moved through the scene with practiced efficiency, photographing everything, bagging evidence, reading rights. Victor and Tyler tried to demand lawyers immediately, claiming police brutality, false imprisonment, all the standard criminal defense tactics. Jessica surprised me. She went quiet, didn't cry, didn't protest, just stared at me with pure hatred in her eyes. The mask was completely off now. She gambled everything on her plan working, and an old rancher from Montana had dismantled it in one night. One of the agents asked me about the gunshot wound in Victor's hand. I explained that he'd pointed a weapon at me with intent to kill, and I'd defended myself. Montana castle doctrine extends to anywhere I have legal right to be. My son's property qualified. Self-defense? Clear and simple. Tom confirmed it, said he'd seen enough legitimate self-defense cases to know one when he saw it. The fact that I'd rendered first aid afterward actually helped my case. Showed I wasn't trying to kill, just neutralize the threat. They loaded the 3 suspects into separate vehicles. Standard procedure. Keep them apart so they can't coordinate stories. Jessica looked back at me as they put her in the car. She promised this wasn't over, that her family's lawyers would tear me apart, that I'd regret ever coming to Denver. I told her I'd been threatened by grizzly bears that scared me more. The EMTs arrived for Ethan. His leg needed surgery, probably multiple operations. The doctors later said he'd have a permanent limp. The emotional and psychological damage would take longer to heal if it ever fully did. But he was alive, and he was free. As they loaded him into the ambulance, he grabbed my hand. His grip was weak but desperate. He wanted to know why I'd come, despite the text message, how I'd known something was wrong. I told him the truth, because he was my son, and a father knows when his child is in danger. Didn't matter how old he got, didn't matter how successful or independent. That instinct doesn't fade with age. If anything, it sharpens. He cried again, different tears this time. Relief, tears. Gratitude, tears. The tears of a man who thought he was going to die and discovered he was going to live. I rode with him to the hospital, sat in the emergency room while they stabilized his leg, treated his wounds, documented his injuries for the prosecution. The doctor said he was lucky. Another day or two, and infection would have killed him. The broken bone would have needed amputation. Lucky. That's what they called it. I called it a father's instinct and a willingness to drive through a blizzard. The DEA agents came by the hospital around 3 a.m. They'd processed the shed scene and wanted my statement. I walked them through everything, finding the text, driving to Denver, the confrontation, the evidence collection, the self-defense shooting. The lead agent, a woman named Rodriguez who couldn't have been more than 35, said I'd handed them a case so airtight that the prosecutors were already discussing plea deals. The evidence I'd gathered was better than what trained law enforcement usually managed. The emails alone would put Jessica away for 20 years. She asked me if I had investigative experience, law enforcement background, military training. I told her I was a cattle rancher who read a lot of detective novels and watched too much TV. She didn't quite believe me, but she didn't push it. Sometimes old men know things that young people haven't learned yet, like patience and thoroughness, and the understanding that real justice requires more than just catching someone. It requires proving their guilt beyond any doubt. By sunrise, the full scope of the operation was becoming clear. Victor's organization had been running drugs through legitimate shipping companies for 15 years. They'd infiltrated 3 other businesses before Ethan's, always targeting successful young entrepreneurs who'd fallen in love with Jessica or her cousins. The women were honey traps, beautiful and sophisticated, designed to get close to men with resources. Ethan wasn't their first victim. He was their 4th. The other 3 had disappeared. One was ruled a suicide. One was a hiking accident. One simply vanished and was presumed to have run off with embezzled money. But the DEA now had enough evidence to reopen all 3 cases. My son's torture might be the key that brought justice for 3 other families who'd lost sons and never knew why. Tom came by the hospital around 8 a.m. with coffee and breakfast sandwiches. We sat in the waiting room like we used to sit in the stands at rodeos, just 2 old men watching the world turn. He told me I'd done good work, also told me I was lucky I hadn't gotten killed, told me that next time I suspected my son was in danger, maybe I should call him first instead of going in alone with just a .45 and righteous anger. I told him there wouldn't be a next time. Told him my son had learned what his mother had always tried to teach him. Trust is earned, not given. And family, real family, will drive through blizzards to save you. The sun came up over Denver Christmas Eve morning, dawning cold and clear. Somewhere in 3 separate holding cells, 3 people who thought they were untouchable were realizing they'd miscalculated badly. And in a hospital bed, my son slept peacefully for the first time in 3 weeks, knowing he was safe. But the story wasn't over yet. Not quite. Christmas Eve in a Denver hospital isn't anyone's idea of holiday celebration, but it beat spending it in a shed waiting to die. Ethan woke up around noon, groggy from pain medication, but clear-eyed enough to ask questions. He wanted to know everything. What happened after I found him, how the arrests went down, what came next. I told him the truth. Jessica and her family were facing federal drug trafficking charges, kidnapping, assault with intent to commit murder, and a dozen other charges the prosecutors were still adding to the list. The evidence was overwhelming. Between the physical evidence, the emails, the text messages, and Ethan's testimony, the prosecution had enough to put them away for decades. But Ethan wanted to know about her specifically, about Jessica, the woman he'd married, trusted, built a life with. He needed to understand how he'd been so blind, how he'd missed the signs. I told him what Tom had told me, that these people were professionals. They'd refined their approach over years, targeted successful young men who were lonely or eager to prove themselves. Jessica had been trained since childhood to spot marks, gain trust, exploit weaknesses. It wasn't his fault he'd been fooled. She'd fooled law enforcement, business partners, even her own college professors who'd written glowing recommendations. She was good at what she did. That didn't make him feel better. If anything, it made him feel worse. He talked about all the moments he'd dismissed as stress or imagination, the times Jessica had been too interested in his business accounts, the times she'd encouraged him to trust her father's business advice, the times she'd isolated him from friends who asked too many questions. The signs had been there. He'd just been too in love to see them. I let him talk. Sometimes a man needs to bleed out the poison before he can heal. The hospital social worker came by in the afternoon. She wanted to discuss Ethan's recovery plan, physical therapy for his leg, counseling for the trauma, security measures for when he was released. The FBI had suggested witness protection, but Ethan refused. He'd built his business from nothing, earned his reputation through hard work. He wasn't going to run and hide. We spent Christmas Eve afternoon making lists, practical lists. Who needed to be contacted about his business? Which lawyers he needed to hire? How to secure his home and company from further infiltration? What steps he needed to take to divorce Jessica and reclaim his life? It felt good, focusing on concrete problems with concrete solutions. That's how you get through trauma. One small step at a time, one decision at a time, one day at a time. Around 7 p.m., Rodriguez came back with news. Jessica had tried to make a deal, offering to testify against her father and brother in exchange for reduced charges. But the prosecutors weren't interested. They had enough evidence to convict all three independently. Her testimony would just be confirmation of what they already knew. She was looking at 25 to life. Victor was looking at 40 to life. Tyler was looking at 30 to life, plus whatever charges came from the reopened murder cases. Rodriguez also brought news about Ethan's company. The DEA had frozen its assets temporarily while they sorted out which operations were legitimate and which were covers for drug trafficking. It would take months, maybe a year, to untangle everything. But she was confident Ethan would get his business back clean. That was something, at least. Tom came by around 9 p.m. with an unexpected guest, my nephew Marcus, who I'd called that morning. Marcus was a lawyer in Billings, sharp as a tack and meaner than a snake when he needed to be. He'd driven down to help Ethan with the legal maze ahead. He'd already started filing motions to freeze Jessica's access to Ethan's accounts, to begin divorce proceedings, to establish a protective order, to reclaim the house, to secure the business. The paperwork alone would take weeks, but Marcus was thorough. He was also furious on Ethan's behalf, which was exactly what we needed. Sometimes the best lawyer is the one who takes things personally. We spent Christmas Eve evening in that hospital room, 3 generations of family making battle plans. Marcus with his legal pads, Tom with his law enforcement contacts, Ethan with his business knowledge, and me with my stubborn refusal to let these people win even 1 inch more than they'd already taken. Around midnight, a nurse came in to check Ethan's vitals and gently suggested we let him rest. The surgery on his leg was scheduled for the day after Christmas, and he needed his strength. We filtered out into the hallway. Marcus headed back to his hotel. Tom went home to his wife. I should have found a hotel room myself, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the hospital. Couldn't shake the irrational fear that something would happen if I wasn't there watching. I found a chair in the waiting room and settled in for the night. Hospital chairs are designed by people who've never had to sleep in them, but I'd slept in worse places. Barn floors during calving season, truck cabs during blizzards, deer blinds during hunting season. I could handle one night in a chair, but I didn't sleep. Couldn't turn my brain off. Kept replaying the last 3 days. The text message, the drive, the shed, the confrontation, the arrests. Kept thinking about how close I'd come to being too late, how many things could have gone wrong. Kept thinking about the 3 other families who hadn't had a stubborn old rancher refusing to believe a text message. Somewhere around 2 a.m., Tom came back. He'd brought a pillow and blanket from his house, plus a thermos of coffee. He said his wife had insisted, said she remembered me from the old days, and knew I'd be too stubborn to get a proper hotel room. We sat together in that waiting room, two old men keeping watch, and talked about the old days, the rodeos, the bar fights, the women we'd loved and lost, the children we'd raised, the decades that had passed since we were young and foolish. Tom mentioned something I hadn't known, that his own son had been approached by someone similar to Jessica 5 years ago. A beautiful woman, seemingly perfect, who'd shown too much interest in his business too quickly. Tom had seen the red flags and warned his son off. The woman had disappeared, moved on to easier targets. He wondered if that woman had been part of the same organization, wondered how many families had been destroyed while he'd been congratulating himself for saving his own son. I told him what I'd learned over 40 years of ranching. You can't save every calf. Some died despite your best efforts. All you can do is save the ones you can and learn from the ones you couldn't. Ethan was saved. That was enough. But as we sat there in the pre-dawn darkness of Christmas morning, both of us knew the real work was just beginning. The arrests were just the first step. Now came the trials, the testimonies, the months of legal battles and media attention and slow, grinding justice, and somewhere in that process, my son would have to rebuild his life from the ground up, rebuild his business, his trust, his sense of self, figure out how to move forward when the person he'd trusted most had tried to destroy him. That would take more than evidence and arrests. That would take time, family, and the kind of stubborn resilience that comes from refusing to let evil win. The sun rose on Christmas morning, and I made myself a promise. I'd stay in Denver as long as Ethan needed me. The ranch could run without me for a while. The cattle could be managed by my hired hands. My son needed his father more than my cows needed their owner, because that's what fathers do. We show up, we stay, we fight. And we don't leave until the danger has passed and our children are safe. The trial began in early April, 3 months after that Christmas Eve in the shed. By then, the case had grown into something bigger than any of us had anticipated. The DEA's investigation had uncovered a network spanning 12 states, involving 17 businesses and generating over $100 million in illicit revenue. Victor's organization wasn't just some family drug operation. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating for 23 years. Jessica wasn't just a spoiled daughter helping her criminal father. She was the architect of their expansion strategy, the one who'd identified target businesses, researched potential marks, and executed the infiltration plans. She had an MBA from Stanford and an IQ that the prosecutor said would have made her a Fortune 500 CEO if she'd chosen a legitimate path. Instead, she'd chosen to destroy lives for profit. The courtroom was packed. Media from across the country, families of the other victims, law enforcement who'd worked the case, and investigators still piecing together the full scope of the damage. I sat in the front row every single day, right behind the prosecution table, where Jessica could see me every time she looked up. I wanted her to see the old rancher she'd dismissed as irrelevant, wanted her to remember that underestimating people is a fatal mistake. Ethan had to testify, had to walk the jury through every detail of his torture, his desperation, his fear, had to explain how he'd discovered the drug operation, how he'd confronted Jessica, how she'd smiled and told him it was too late. Her family already controlled his business through the contracts she'd convinced him to sign. had to describe the beatings, the broken leg, the days chained in that shed, wondering if each day would be his last. The jury listened in silence. Some of them cried. The judge had to call several recesses because the testimony was so graphic, so disturbing, that people needed breaks to process what they were hearing. Jessica showed no emotion. She sat at the defense table in expensive clothes and perfect makeup, looking like a successful businesswoman wrongly accused, not a criminal facing life in prison. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a victim of her father's abuse, a woman forced into crime by family pressure and threatened violence. It might have worked if we hadn't had her emails, the ones where she bragged to her cousins about how easy it was to manipulate men, the ones where she called Ethan her biggest success and joked about how quickly he'd fallen for her act, the ones where she'd planned his murder in cold, clinical detail. The prosecution played those emails on the courtroom monitors. Read them aloud. Let the jury hear her voice, not the demure, victimized voice she used in court, but the arrogant, contemptuous voice she used when she thought no one was listening. I watched her face as her own words condemned her, watched the mask crack just for a moment, and saw the rage underneath. She knew she'd lost. Victor's trial was shorter, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his lawyer knew it. They tried for a plea deal, 30 years in exchange for naming his suppliers and distributors. The prosecution countered with 40 years minimum, no parole possibility. He took it. Tyler got 25 to life, with additional murder charges pending from the reopened cases. The evidence linking him to the other 3 victims was circumstantial, but mounting. The families of those victims finally had hope for closure. The trial lasted 5 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was set for 2 weeks later. Jessica's lawyer made one last desperate attempt, arguing for leniency based on her age, her education, her potential for rehabilitation. Brought in character witnesses who testified about the smart, charming young woman they'd known. The judge listened politely. Then he asked if the defense had anything else. That's when I stood up. The judge recognized me from the trial testimony and nodded. Asked if I wanted to make a statement. I did. I walked to the front of that courtroom, looked directly at Jessica, and told her exactly what I thought. Told her that evil doesn't always look like monsters. Sometimes it looks like beautiful, educated women who weaponize trust. Told her that she hadn't just destroyed my son's life, she'd destroyed his ability to trust, to love, to build connections with other people. That kind of damage doesn't heal with time. It leaves scars that last forever. Told her that the other families deserved justice, too. The ones whose sons she'd helped murder. The ones who never got closure, never got answers, never got a stubborn old rancher who refused to believe a text message. Told her that I hoped she'd spend every day of her sentence thinking about the lives she'd destroyed for money. Hoped she'd live long enough to understand what she'd taken from people. The judge thanked me and asked me to sit down. I did. Then he delivered his sentence. Life without possibility of parole. Maximum security federal prison. No special treatment. No reduced sentence for good behavior. No deals. Jessica screamed, actually screamed, the first real emotion she'd shown in the entire trial. Security had to restrain her as she cursed the judge, the jury, me, Ethan, everyone. The mask was completely gone now. What remained was rage and disbelief that her plans had failed. They dragged her out of the courtroom still screaming. The last thing I heard her say was that she would have gotten away with it if I'd just stayed on my ranch and died like I was supposed to. The judge banged his gavel. Court adjourned. Outside, the families of the other victims found me, thanked me, told me that because of my investigation, their cases were being reopened with real evidence and real hope for justice. One mother grabbed my hands and cried, saying her son's death might finally mean something. I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't feel like a hero. Just felt tired. Ethan was waiting by my truck. His leg had healed enough that he only needed a cane now, not crutches. The doctor said the limp would be permanent, but he was learning to work with it. Physical scars heal faster than emotional ones. He asked me what I told Jessica in court. I repeated it word for word. He said he wished he could have said those things himself. Wished he'd had the strength to face her like that. I told him he'd done the hardest part. He'd survived. He'd testified. He'd reclaimed his life. That took more strength than any speech. We drove back to his house, the Victorian beauty that had been the scene of his nightmare. He'd decided to keep it, reclaim it, make new memories to replace the old ones. Seemed like the right choice. That night, we sat on his back porch, the same porch I'd snuck past that December night, and drank expensive whiskey. Ethan said it felt strange, celebrating justice when so much had been lost. His marriage, 3 years of his life, his innocence about human nature, his trust in people. I told him that sometimes loss is the price of wisdom. Sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what matters. And what mattered was that he was alive, free, and strong enough to rebuild. The trial was over. Justice was served. But the real work, healing, rebuilding, learning to trust again, that work was just beginning. 6 months after the trial ended, I finally went back to Montana. Ethan's business was running smoothly again. The DEA had cleared it after a thorough investigation, and with Marcus's help, he'd restructured the company with ironclad security measures. Background checks on all partners and investors, financial audits every quarter, a security consultant who reviewed all major contracts and relationships. He'd rebuilt his staff, hired a COO to handle day-to-day operations while he focused on strategy, and slowly, carefully, started trusting again. Not the blind trust of his youth, but the careful, measured trust of someone who'd learned that faith needs to be earned. The physical therapy had worked wonders. His leg was strong enough that the cane was more psychological comfort than physical necessity. Some days he didn't need it at all. The limp would always be there, a permanent reminder of those weeks in the shed, but it didn't slow him down anymore. The emotional healing took longer. He'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma, attending a support group for victims of violent crime, and slowly processing everything that had happened. Some days were better than others. Some days the memories came back so strong that he couldn't leave his house. But those days got fewer and farther between. He'd started dating again, cautiously, with friends vetting potential partners, taking things slow. He told me it felt strange, approaching relationships like business deals, but he wasn't ready to trust his own judgment yet. Maybe someday. For now, he was learning to be comfortable alone, to build a life that didn't depend on another person's validation. The house had been transformed. He'd renovated the entire backyard, torn down the shed that had been his prison, planted a garden where it used to stand. Roses for his mother, who'd loved them. Oak trees for strength and permanence. A bench where he sat sometimes reading or just thinking. The inside was different, too. New furniture, new colors, new memories. He'd hosted Thanksgiving there, invited the families of the other victims, created new associations to replace the old ones. It was becoming his home again, not Jessica's crime scene. Victor died in prison in August. Heart attack, the report said. He was 72, overweight, stressed from legal battles over the remaining murder charges. I didn't shed a tear. Neither did Ethan. Tyler was still fighting his additional charges, but the evidence kept mounting. DNA from the other victims' cases, financial records showing payments around the times of their deaths, testimony from former associates who'd turned state's evidence. He'd likely die in prison too, just slower. Jessica was in maximum security in California. No visitors allowed except her lawyer, no phone calls, no internet. Just her and her thoughts for the rest of her life. Sometimes I wondered if she thought about Ethan, about what she'd destroyed for money. Probably not. Sociopaths rarely feel genuine remorse. The families of the other 3 victims got their closure. One case was ruled a murder, the remains exhumed and reburied with proper ceremony. One accident was officially reclassified as homicide. One missing person was declared legally dead, allowing his parents to finally mourn properly. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. The night before I left Denver, Ethan took me to dinner at the steakhouse, where he'd proposed to Jessica 3 years earlier. He'd avoided the place since the trial, but he said it was time to reclaim it, to prove that she didn't get to own his memories forever. We ate good food, drank better wine, and talked about the future. He was thinking about expanding the business into renewable energy logistics, something clean and forward-thinking. Thinking about starting a foundation to help other victims of intimate partner financial abuse. Thinking about turning his nightmare into something that could help other people avoid the same fate. I told him his mother would have been proud. She'd always said that pain either makes you bitter or better, and he was choosing better. He asked me how I'd known to come that night, how I'd known the text wasn't really from him. We'd danced around the question for months, but he wanted the real answer. I told him the truth because I'm his father, and fathers know their children, know how they talk, how they think, how they'd react in any situation. That text was wrong on every level. The words, the tone, the cruelty. It was a scream for help disguised as a dismissal. And when your child screams for help, you come. Doesn't matter if you're 67 and they're 34. Doesn't matter if they're successful and independent. Doesn't matter if it's inconvenient or dangerous or if you have to drive through a blizzard to get there. You come. That's what fathers do. Ethan cried into his steak. Good tears this time. Healing tears. The next morning, I loaded my truck and headed back to Montana. 7 hours through spring sunshine, the opposite of that December blizzard. The mountains were green, the cattle were healthy, and my ranch hands had kept everything running smoothly in my absence. But something had changed in me during those 6 months in Denver. I'd always thought of myself as a rancher first, father second. Work was what defined me. The ranch was my identity. But I'd learned something in that shed, in that hospital, in that courtroom. Being a father isn't a part-time job. It's not something you do when you're not working. It's the work, the most important work, the work that matters most when everything else is stripped away. So I made changes, hired a full-time ranch manager to handle the day-to-day operations, started spending more time visiting Ethan, checking in, making sure he was really okay and not just pretending for my benefit. Started calling my two daughters more, asking about their lives, paying attention to the small signs that something might be wrong. Started living like someone who understood that tomorrow isn't guaranteed and the people you love need to know they're loved while they're still here to hear it. I also started speaking. Local law enforcement invited me to talk about recognizing fraud and elder exploitation. Victim advocacy groups wanted to hear about my experience. Business owners wanted to know how to protect their companies from infiltration. I told them all the same thing. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself. And if someone you love is in danger, don't wait for permission or proof or certainty. Just go. Sometimes being right is less important than being there. Ethan came to visit the ranch in September, first time he'd been back since the trial. We rode horses through the mountains, checked on the cattle, sat on my porch drinking coffee and watching the sunset over the peaks. He told me he'd met someone, a woman who ran a bookstore, knew nothing about logistics or business, had her own life and her own interests. They were taking it slow, really slow, but there was something there, something that might be real. I told him to trust himself again, trust cautiously, trust carefully, but trust, because living in fear isn't living at all. He asked me if I was happy with how everything turned out. It seemed like a strange question until I realized what he was really asking. Was it worth it? The violence, the danger, the 6 months away from my ranch, the permanent changes to both our lives? I looked at my son, alive, healing, building a new life from the ashes of the old one, and gave him the only honest answer I had. Every single second was worth it, because that's what love looks like. Not flowers and cards and pretty words, but showing up in the middle of a blizzard when a text message smells wrong, breaking down doors when your instinct says someone's in trouble, fighting wolves and criminals and your own fear because someone you love needs you. The sun set over Montana, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Ethan sat beside me in comfortable silence, the kind you can only share with family. The mountains stood eternal, the cattle grazed peacefully, and somewhere in California, a woman who'd tried to destroy my son sat in a cell counting down the decades until she died. Justice was served. My son was safe, and I was home. Later that night, as Ethan got ready for bed in the guest room, I sat in my living room and thought about that December night. The text message, the drive, the decision to keep going even when logic said to turn back. I thought about the 3 other families who'd lost sons because no one had trusted their instincts, about all the victims who'd never gotten justice because their fathers or mothers or friends had believed the lies instead of the truth. And I made myself a promise. I'd tell this story whenever anyone would listen. Tell it to other parents, other families, other people who loved someone enough to fight for them. Tell them that age doesn't make you irrelevant. That experience is a weapon sharper than any knife, that sometimes an old rancher's instinct is worth more than all the evidence in the world. Because every father, every mother, every person who loves someone needs to know. When your instinct screams that something's wrong, listen to it. When someone you love is in danger, go to them. Don't wait for proof. Don't wait for permission. Don't let anyone convince you that you're overreacting or imagining things. Just go. Your children, no matter how old they get, need to know they're not alone. Need to know that someone will come for them when the darkness closes in. Need to know that love doesn't give up, doesn't turn back, doesn't accept text messages at face value. I'm 68 now. My knees still ache, my back still hurts, and I'll never be as fast or as strong as I was in my youth. But I'm still here, still standing, still ready to drive through blizzards if that's what my family needs. Because I'm a father, and fathers don't quit. The mountains outside my window stood eternal in the moonlight, silent witnesses to everything that had happened. Somewhere in Denver, my son slept safely in his reclaimed home. Somewhere in California, justice was served every single day in a maximum security cell. And here in Montana, an old rancher sat in his favorite chair, grateful for instincts that wouldn't stay quiet, for courage that overcame common sense, and for one more chance to save his son. The story's over now, but the lesson remains. Listen to your instincts. Trust your love. And never, ever give up on the people who matter most. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, I hope my story taught you something. I hope you'll never doubt your instincts when someone you love is in danger. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this story resonated with you, subscribe to hear more stories about survival, family, and the strength we find when we refuse to give up. Because in the end, we're not defined by what happens to us. We're defined by what we do when everything goes wrong and the people we love need us most. Stay strong, trust yourself, and never stop fighting for family.